The most definitive sign that your civilization is about to collapse is not the violence outside your walls, but the comfortable mediocrity you have built within them. We are conditioned to look for the fire, the sudden external shock, the invading force that shatters the structure. But the truth, the dark mechanism of decay, operates far more subtly. Civilizations do not die in battle, they die in the quiet atrophy of their own souls, succumbing to a slow, luxurious suicide by comfort. This process, which history repeats with sickening precision, I call the Roman filter. It is the final, inescapable hurdle that every complex society seems structurally programmed to fail. The Roman filter posits that the very elements we celebrate as markers of modern progress, hyperspecialization, material abundance, the elevation of subjective feelings over objective truth, are in fact the final, fatal vulnerabilities. You are not living in the golden age. You are living in the self-satisfied coma that precedes the terminal diagnosis. My unique thesis is this: a society is not filtered out by its problems, but by its solutions. We mistake the optimization of efficiency for genuine resilience, allowing the necessary friction of existence to be slowly sandpapered away. We create a system so streamlined, so focused on eliminating pain and maximizing subjective happiness, that it loses the functional ability to tolerate hardship, complexity, or even simple contradictory facts. The moment a society prioritizes feeling good over being truthful, the Roman filter is activated. If you feel this gnawing discomfort, this creeping suspicion that the narratives you are being fed are designed for comfortable compliance rather than necessary clarity, then consider subscribing now. This is where we look past the noise and dissect the underlying code of human behavior, charting the inevitable trajectory towards systemic failure. The first and perhaps most insidious signal of the Roman filter at work is the mass abandonment of delayed gratification in favor of instantaneous, trivial reward. Look around. The societal metric of success is no longer the ability to build, endure, or sacrifice over generations, but the instantaneous metric of engagement. Attention spans have not merely shortened, they have become weaponized against deep thought. When the public sphere is flooded with dopamine hits and outrage loops, it achieves a kind of cognitive sterilization. Genuine complex problems, climate stability, geopolitical strategy, structural economic failure, require long arcs of attention, painful trade-offs, and uncomfortable acceptance of ambiguity. But the filter ensures these difficult necessities are drowned out by the endless cascading spectacle of trivial, moral panics and celebrity worship. The citizen transforms into a consumer of emotionally potent, low-calorie content, rendering them functionally illiterate in the language of reality. They have traded the hard currency of meaningful effort for the fiat currency of digital validation. This leads directly to the second symptom, the great specialization trap. The modern world is structured on the principle of extreme expertise. While specialization drives technological innovation, it simultaneously breeds an intellectual fragility within the individual. Nobody knows how to do anything essential outside their hyper-specific silo. We celebrate this dependency, viewing the generalist as an amateur. But when the system inevitably cracks, when the supply chain falters or the bureaucratic infrastructure jams, the specialist is helpless. The plumber cannot farm, the software engineer cannot fix the power grid, and the academic philosopher cannot maintain order. Ancient societies demanded functional competence across multiple domains. They demanded resilient individuals. We demand obedient complexity and specialized ignorance. The Roman filter is the moment a society becomes too complex to manage its own fragility, optimizing itself into a corner where every single point of failure is catastrophic because nobody holds a holistic map of the territory anymore. The final dark psychological mechanism initiating the filter is the institutionalization of fragility. We have entered an era where suffering is treated not as an inevitable component of the human condition to be overcome, but as a bureaucratic error to be legislated out of existence. This is the profound error that kills civilizations. by systematically shielding individuals from necessary mental and emotional hardship, by pathologizing discomfort, by ensuring that every interaction is safe, predictable, and affirming. We succeed only in manufacturing brittle, easily offended citizens incapable of confronting the harsh realities required for societal maintenance. The great ancient civilizations understood that virtue was forged in the fire of necessity. Modern civilization attempts to cool the forge entirely. When the inevitable external shock arrives, be it economic, viral, or martial, the population collapses internally first, paralyzed by a reality they were systematically taught was impossible. They possess the knowledge of scholars, but the emotional fortitude of infants, and societies built on infant psychologies do not survive the winter. This is the rot within the foundation. The psychological crisis of our time is not depression, it is the systematic revocation of meaningful suffering. We have mistaken the surgical removal of discomfort for the attainment of happiness, creating a civilization that is psychologically neutered, terrified of friction, and incapable of converting adversity into competence. When you institutionalize fragility, you force the individual to operate within a constructed bubble of absolute safety. The suffering begins the moment the bubble requires defending, which is always because reality is inherently sharp and indifferent to human emotional need. The modern citizen is suffering not because life is hard, but because they have been trained to believe that hard times are an ontological mistake, a glitch in the programming of a universe that owes them perpetual calm. This leads to a terrifying cognitive displacement. Instead of adapting the self to the environment must be policed and purified to match the self's brittle demands. We subcontract the painful work of psychological processing. We pay the institutionalized debt collector, the media, the therapist, the HR department, the governmental regulator, to categorize, label, and dispose of everything that causes us necessary strain. Disagreement is not a conflict of ideas to be resolved through friction, but a form of psychological violence to be reported. Uncertainty is not the fertile ground of innovation, but a source of generalized anxiety disorder demanding immediate medication. This outsourcing is a profound act of spiritual negligence. Every time you allow an external agent to smooth the edges of reality for you, you forfeit a small piece of your own sovereignty, and, crucially, your ability to handle the next shock. The suffering manifests as a paralyzing sense of learned helplessness. The individual knows, deep in the dark recesses of their mind, that they are not actually robust, only insulated. They know they are living on borrowed resilience, and the resulting anxiety, the chronic low-grade fear of exposure, is the price of their false security. If these insights feel necessary, if you find yourself recognizing the structure of the world others simply inhabit, you need to be part of the community that prioritizes this difficult analysis. Please subscribe now to ensure you don't miss the next critical breakdown of the forces shaping our decline. This manufactured certainty, this preference for the map over the territory, breeds a peculiar form of psychological tyranny. The specialist, the fragile citizen, and the bureaucrat all desperately require the world to be simple, manageable, and deterministic, because complexity introduces risk, and risk necessitates personal courage, which has been bred out of the system. Therefore, anything that resists categorization, anything that pushes back against the established narrative, must be aggressively eliminated, not just physically, but conceptually. This is the mechanism behind the relentless pathologizing of difference. If you hold an uncomfortable truth, you are not merely wrong, you are dangerous. You are not simply operating with a different perspective. You are committing harm. Language itself becomes weaponized to defend the illusion of systemic safety, transforming philosophical debate into a medical emergency. The suffering experienced by the individual operating within this system is the chronic psychological fatigue of maintaining a lie. They must constantly police their own thoughts and language, not out of ethical duty, but out of the sheer terror of being designated as the source of necessary friction, the impurity that must be purged to maintain the collective delusion of invulnerability. The core affliction is the loss of telos, the purpose defined by genuine challenge. If the primary goal of life is safety and comfort, The moment those are achieved, the individual is left with nothing but the dull, terrifying vacuum of meaninglessness. This is the ultimate cost of optimizing society into a perfect, safe container. When the container is flawless, the inhabitant looks inward and finds only the soft, unformed core of an existence that has never been tested. Our ancestors sought trials precisely because the successful navigation of adversity provided the bedrock of identity and self-respect. We eliminate the trials, and in doing so, we eliminate the grounds for self-respect, replacing it with temporary affirmation from the institutions that built the cage. This is the agony of the modern soul, a perfect, sterilized environment, breeding an existential sense of pointlessness, occasionally masked by frantic consumption or self-righteous outrage. They suffer because they have traded the possibility of deep pain for the guarantee of shallow existence. If you believe this kind of deep, challenging content is essential in an age of intellectual fluff, please hit that subscribe button right now and support the production of analyses that refuse to pull their punches. This psychological dynamic accelerates the Roman filter by creating a society obsessed with the immediate state, incapable of dealing with time. The fragile mind cannot tolerate delayed gratification, not just economically, but emotionally. The moment a problem appears, it must be solved now, even if the immediate solution creates 10 greater problems down the road. We witness this catastrophic short-term thinking in every domain. The inability to make necessary sacrifices for long-term fiscal stability. The political paralysis when faced with environmental crises requiring decades of consistent effort, and the personal inability to endure discomfort for the sake of future virtue. We are a civilization of infants, demanding the immediate bottle, screaming if the temperature is not precisely correct, and entirely unaware that the caretaker is exhausted, and the external structure holding the nursery together is already rotting. The collapse will be psychological long before it is material. The physical walls will fall because the people within them stopped believing in the value of the long, hard climb, preferring instead the soft, quick descent into managed oblivion. The true suffering, then, is the realization that your entire inherited life has been a colossal structural Ponzi scheme, where the comfortable present was bought by mortgaging the catastrophic future. And when that future arrives, the emotionally underdeveloped individual, having been trained for a lifetime that discomfort is unnatural and wrong, will not rise to meet it. They will simply shatter. This short-term emotional calculus has metastasized into the very institutions meant to safeguard the future. We no longer ask, is this solution effective? We ask, does this solution feel correct? Does it minimize immediate political backlash or emotional distress within the loudest demographic? Consider the bureaucratic horror show of the last decade, where the primary objective of major institutions, whether academic, governmental, or corporate, has shifted from maximizing competence to maximizing psychological comfort and minimizing liability. The modern mandate is not to solve the deep problem, but to create a public relations facade that suggests the problem is being handled, while simultaneously punishing any internal dissenting voice that might shatter the collective delusion. The brutal, necessary, real-world example of this failure is everywhere you look, specifically in the slow, grinding death of engineering and complex logistical maintenance. We are a civilization that celebrates new, shiny apps and social technologies, but we actively neglect the invisible concrete arteries of civilization. The dams, the power grids, the sewage systems, and the complex logistical choreography that keeps the world functional. Why? Because maintaining a 40-year-old sewer pipe offers zero political capital and zero dopamine hits. It is hard, dirty, long-term work, requiring quiet dedication and the toleration of risk assessment, not risk elimination. It is the absolute antithesis of the immediate state. When the bridge inevitably collapses, we engage in an immediate, hysterical surge of outrage and investigation, demanding accountability now, which is itself a short-circuiting mechanism designed merely to discharge the collective anxiety rather than institute the decades of tedious, thankless preventative funding that was actually required. This is the structural Ponzi scheme made visible. We traded the reliability of the future for the budget surplus or the emotional calm of the present. And we call this prudent management. This institutional cowardice is not accidental. It is a calculated avoidance of pain. When faced with a choice between a 90% effective, unpopular solution and a 40% effective, highly popular solution, the fragile system will always choose the latter. It prefers the illusion of safety delivered immediately to the reality of safety delivered arduously over time. Discussing this level of structural decay and the intellectual and moral cowardice that fuels it is not comfortable. It requires facing facts that polite society has banned from discussion. If you value this kind of raw, uncompromising analysis, the kind of work that refuses to sanitize reality for mass consumption, then please consider subscribing. It's the single most powerful way to support independent, deep dives into the mechanics of societal breakdown and ensure that this difficult content can continue to be made. The consequence of this managed fragility is not just physical infrastructure failure, but the total crippling of intellectual courage. We have outsourced moral judgment to algorithms and administrative policy, believing that if a decision is sanctioned by a process, it relieves the individual of ethical responsibility. When the individual is no longer required to bear the weight of difficult judgment, when the system tells them precisely what to think, what to feel, and how to react to pain, they atrophy. The soul shrinks in proportion to the guaranteed comfort of its container. This is why the highest status today is achieved not through production or mastery, but through the public performance of victimhood, because vulnerability and sensitivity have become the new currency of moral authority. The moment discomfort is equated with injustice, the door is open to a totalitarianism of feeling, where the state or the institution is mandated to correct not just material inequality, but emotional imbalance. When suffering becomes a policy problem, freedom dissolves, because the only entity capable of managing the infinite complexity of collective feeling is an infinitely intrusive, crushing administrative apparatus. We are begging for our own cages, provided the bars are padded and the lighting is soft. The grand societal lie we are currently swallowing whole is that the pathway to strength is paved by the radical acceptance of weakness. We have rebranded self-indulgence as authenticity, convincing ourselves that the highest moral act is not the mastery of our lesser instincts, but their unrestrained exhibition. This obsession with finding your truth is, in practice, a sophisticated form of evasion. It encourages the individual to excavate their past traumas not as fuel for future resilience, but as permanent, sacred excuses for current failure. We mistake the relentless articulation of pain for the actual processing of it. This isn't healing, it is the construction of a psychological bunker, where the individual uses the narrative of their own fragility to ward off all criticism, all challenge, and all expectation of growth. We have created an entire therapeutic ecosystem dedicated to eliminating friction from the human experience, pathologizing the very struggles that historically built character. Grief is now a managed illness, frustration is a triggering event, and disagreement is framed as a form of structural violence. By administering away the necessary confrontation with difficulty, we ensure that when true catastrophe arrives, we will be psychologically defenseless, having trained ourselves only for retreat and complaint. We are told that awareness is the solution: mental health awareness, systemic awareness, historical awareness. But this deluge of awareness often functions as intellectual paralysis. It gives the soft, modern mind so many layers of contextual explanation that it relieves the individual of the burden of simple action. When the problem is understood to be infinitely complex and externally caused by forces beyond your control, the patriarchy, the market, the climate, the algorithm, the only logical response is not effort, but despair and lobbying for institutional intervention. The man who truly takes responsibility stops analyzing the system and starts analyzing his own limitations. He seeks competence, not comfort. If you find this exploration of the difficult, often uncomfortable intersection between psychology and administrative decay valuable, if you recognize the intellectual importance of resisting the comforting narratives peddled by the mainstream, then I strongly encourage you to subscribe right now, This depth of analysis cannot survive without the direct support of those who demand more than surface-level platitudes. Subscribing ensures that this channel can continue to tackle the sacred cows of modernity with the rigor and uncompromising honesty that defines this work. The atrophy is complete when the individual internalizes the administrative mindset, applying the metrics of policy and managed risk to the messy, non-linear reality of the soul. The modern quest is not for transcendence, but for optimization, a frictionless existence achieved by preemptively eliminating all variables that might cause existential friction. Yet the human soul is not a spreadsheet to be optimized. It is a furnace to be tested. The only way to forge moral weight is through the fire of unmitigated suffering and consequence. When the system guarantees the removal of consequence, when it guarantees a safety net not just for physical needs but for emotional ones, it strips life of its dramatic force. We are left with administrative man, a figure who is exquisitely tuned to policy language, adept at navigating institutional structures, and utterly incapable of autonomous moral weight or heroic action. Heroism requires a world that is fundamentally dangerous and indifferent, a world that refuses to promise safety. We have exchanged the possibility of genuine tragedy and glory for the certainty of benign, systemic mediocrity. And the most terrifying part of this trade is that we genuinely believe we are safer for having made it. We have sacrificed the vertical ascent of the spirit for the horizontal expansion of guaranteed minimum contentment. The psychological cost of this administrative existence is a quiet, simmering nihilism, often misdiagnosed as generalized anxiety. When the system eliminates meaningful struggle, the human need for friction does not vanish. It simply turns inward, creating an elaborate, self-referential battle against ephemeral threats. We become experts in managing our own discomfort, mistaking the skillful curation of personal emotional states for actual moral development. This is why the modern psychological landscape is dominated by the language of therapeutic boundary setting and the incessant meticulous policing of toxic thoughts. Because we have been stripped of actual external enemies worthy of our courage, we are forced to invent enemies within the labyrinth of our own minds. We suffer not from hardship, but from the spiritual exhaustion of perpetually feeling like we should be struggling more profoundly than we are, while simultaneously being structurally prevented from ever encountering a truly consequential challenge. The soul, starving for the weight of reality, begins to feed on itself. This internal displacement creates the burden of ontological weightlessness. The administrative man is safe from the sharp edges of the world, but he pays for that safety by being constantly unsure of his own existence. He lacks the clear, undeniable confirmation of self that only immediate, high-stakes action can provide. He knows he has potential, but potential without pressure is merely a hypothetical shadow. It never becomes substance. This is the profound suffering unique to our time. We are burdened by the knowledge of what we could be, paralyzed by the absence of forces powerful enough to compel us into what we must be. The system has successfully flattened the topography of life, eliminating the peaks of glory and the valleys of catastrophic failure, leaving us stranded on an endless, featureless plateau of guaranteed low-grade security. If you are finding this necessary critique of modern psychological architecture challenging, if you feel the truth of this analysis demanding more of your attention, recognizing that this is not comfortable content designed merely to affirm your pre-existing biases, then consider this a deliberate, crucial reminder. Only by subscribing and engaging with this channel do we ensure that content willing to dissect these sacred lies survives the algorithmic push toward feel-good banality. Your commitment is the only viable defense against the inevitable slide toward intellectual superficiality. The tragedy deepens when we realize that the administrative state relies fundamentally on perpetuating a childish view of the self. If the individual is a fragile entity, incapable of processing failure or managing risk, then the administrative apparatus becomes an essential, moral guardian. To maintain this guardianship, the state and its cultural proxies must continuously pathologize the human capacity for resilience, transforming suffering from a necessary ingredient for growth into a medical condition requiring intervention. Adversity is no longer seen as a teacher, but as a bug in the code of reality that must be patched, medicated, or litigated away. The result is a generation of hypersensitized adults who are experts in self-diagnosis and therapeutic language, yet entirely unskilled in enduring the unavoidable cruelty of existence. They mistake vulnerability, the performance of emotional transparency, for actual strength, when true strength is defined precisely by the capacity to absorb devastating blows and still choose to stand. The administrative ideal is a self that requires constant management, constant validation, and constant protection. It is a self designed to be dependent, never sovereign. We are being trained out of heroism and into compliant victimhood, because a victim is perpetually manageable, whereas a hero is perpetually unpredictable. The administrative impulse always favors the predictable. The administrative self is not sustainable. It is a psychological house built on sand, ready to collapse the moment real pressure, real tragedy, arrives, because it has never been allowed the necessary exposure to stress that forges true load-bearing strength. The required act of spiritual defiance, therefore, is excruciatingly simple and profoundly difficult. We must stop defining ourselves by our injuries and start defining ourselves by our competence. We must reject the soft comfort of the diagnosis and accept the agonizing, heavy burden of responsibility. That exact pain you are trying to medicate away, to therapize out of existence, or to litigate against the world for causing, is the raw material of your unique power. It is the unworked clay from which the sovereign self is built. This is the definitive verdict. The only way out of the current psychological architecture of dependence is through a renewed, aggressive commitment to self-mastery. Freedom is not the absence of external constraint. That is merely an illusion of comfort. True freedom is the internal capacity to navigate chaos, to endure failure, and to require nothing from the outside world for your own structural integrity. It means trading the language of the victim, which offers fleeting pity but infinite weakness, for the language of the agent, which offers no sympathy but grants undeniable hard-won strength. You must recognize that the administrative impulse will never cease its efforts to diminish your stature, because a populace of giants is ungovernable. You must deliberately choose the path of difficulty, because difficulty is the forge of sovereignty. My final thought on this is perhaps the hardest to swallow. The modern project is a campaign to erase the tragic dimension of human existence, promising a sanitized, perfectly safe emotional experience. But when you eliminate tragedy, you do not elevate happiness. You merely eliminate profundity. The meaning of a life is not found in the moments of ease, but in the scar tissue collected during your most devastating confrontations. Stop waiting for permission or validation from the systems that profit from your fragility. Stop seeking salvation in the clinical language of deficit. Be done with the perpetual management of symptoms, and dedicate yourself instead to the relentless, messy, painful construction of value. Sovereignty is not a birthright. It is earned by action and sustained by defiance. The truly free person is not the one protected from the world, but the one capable of mastering it. If this deep, uncomfortable truth resonates with you, if you refuse to live in the well-managed dependent nursery they have constructed for your soul, then I ask you to join this community. Hit that subscribe button now, and let us continue this essential, difficult work of intellectual insurrection together. The verdict, then, is simple. The managed life is a guaranteed path to spiritual mediocrity, a comfortable death sentence served out over decades. You cannot outsource the necessity of pain without simultaneously abandoning the possibility of transcendence. True sovereignty is simply the capacity to stand in the fire of reality and refuse to burn. It is the recognition that the world does not owe you ease, but that you owe yourself the maximum possible expression of your potential. Do not mistake temporary calm for genuine peace. Peace is the quiet confidence that even if everything external collapses, you possess the internal architecture to rebuild. Therefore, your ultimate allegiance must be to that higher self, which demands effort, difficulty, and the messy pursuit of truth. The system wants you small. Your sacred duty is to grow anyway. The final verdict is this. The most lethal weapon in the modern arsenal is not the bomb, but the promise of total security. It paralyzes ambition and sanctifies cowardice. We have confused psychological fragility for virtue, and in doing so, we have committed the ultimate treason against the human spirit. the willing abandonment of potential. Stop asking what the world can do for your safety and start asking what you must do for your soul's integrity. The great existential challenge is not merely surviving, but surviving on your own terms, accountable only to the standards of excellence you set for yourself. Every great life is defined not by its protections, but by its exposures. You must seek out the difficulty, not because suffering is inherently good, but because suffering is the only reliable catalyst for genuine change. The pursuit of perpetual ease is nothing less than the philosophical equivalent of intellectual suicide. You are owed nothing but the consequences of your choices. So choose wisely. Choose the hard, messy road of creation and confrontation over the smooth, sterile highway of consumption and compliance. The price of true selfhood is high, demanding not just vigilance but the absolute willingness to break the narrative of comfort. This is the place where we reject the anesthesia. If you are one of the few who still believes that courage is a skill, not a diagnosis, if you are tired of trading your depth for superficial calm, and if you understand that intellectual resistance is now a moral imperative, then stay. This community is built on the refusal to be managed. If you are ready to continue the fight against the spiritual mediocrity that threatens to consume the modern world, then hit that subscribe button now. Let us build this fortress of uncomfortable truth together. The final verdict is that your highest potential lies exactly where your deepest fear resides. Do not trade your existential freedom for psychological calm. Choose the confrontation. Your sacred task is self-authorship. Join us in this fortress of uncomfortable truth. Subscribe